I had a pit in my stomach, not just for the fact that there was somebody capable of doing that, who's wearing a uniform, who's supposed to be out protecting me and you and my children, um, would take it upon himself to do that, but that happened 400 days ago, and that the only reason that last Tuesday we were able to see the video and that he was charged was because a judge said stop blocking the video. And the question that you have to ask is, when you see something that horrific, why wasn't all hands on deck to make sure that we had justice for this young man?
And when you say all hands on deck, tell me what that means.
I mean, so you had the video,
Mm-hmm.
you had the police witnesses, you had the civilian witnesses, you had the autopsy report, you knew what gun it was, so you didn't need like ballistics because you saw him shooting. You know, so when you're reviewing a case like this isn't a whodunit. You know, I used to work in felony review where we'd have to review these cases. It wasn't a whodunit. You knew who did it. And the question of looking at, you know, was this part of the execution of his duties? You know, you have to be meticulous and thoughtful and all those things to make sure that you are charging him correctly.
It was part of an execution, but go ahead.
But it wasn't 400 days.
Okay.
And the question that I was struck with, you know, this was a young man who had come through juvenile court. I was a supervisor in the courtroom that he was in. I knew the judge, I knew the prosecutors, I knew the defense attorneys who had this young man's case. He had a really rough life. And the question that you ask yourself is, was all hands not on deck? Was it so easy to dismiss what happened to him because who was going to come asking questions? Who was, I mean, to your point about the parents marching the other day, it was like, who was going to come ask questions for him? And when you finally saw a child struck down in that manner, and you realize that for a year there was a concerted effort to hide this from view, and only because it was going to be on public display was our justice system enacted to do something. I was, as a mother, horrified. As a former prosecutor, I was angered. And as a resident of Chicago for my whole life, I was embarrassed that this is how we do justice in this town. There was no reason. There was absolutely no reason that 400 days should have gone by.
So I'm going to take that 400 days. We're going to look at when the shooting occurred, because it happened during that very heated Democratic primary. So my question becomes, and I'm going to throw this to Charles. Charles, why hold the tape? Like, why? Because I guess for me, I don't understand what benefit is it for Anita Alvarez to hold the tape.
You know,
she didn't have an election.
Yeah. You know, first of all, let me say the tragedy here is the loss of a young life.
Yes.
That is the greatest tragedy. But not far behind it is this reality that this is another steaming pile of Chicago politics at its absolute worst. I mean, the fact that nothing was done about this video, I think, is part and parcel of the culture in the Chicago Police Department and the Independent Police Review Authority. It used to be, what do they used to call it? Professional standards at some point. Called it something else at some point. But where you do nothing when officers commit crimes, essentially. And this has been going on for a long time. You'd be surprised at the number of cases that I've followed. I remember one in particular, the Aaron Harrison case. This young man was running from the police on the west side. And again, we heard the narrative. He had a gun, he turned, and he pointed the gun at the officer, and the officer fired. Fearing for his life, the officer fired and shot this young man down. Well, once his family sued the police department, and they did forensics on the gun that was found next to Aaron Harrison's body, they found that there were no fingerprints on this gun. This gun actually had an origin that was easily traced. So they knew where the gun came from. It didn't have any crimes on it or anything, and how did Aaron Harrison get this gun? But there were no prints, no DNA on the weapon, but the weapon was found, and it was determined in court, in a civil court. The jury was convinced this kid did not point a gun at the police officer, and the officer shot him. Well, this Aaron Harrison's family was awarded a sum of money in the millions of dollars. I went to Gary McCarthy shortly thereafter the verdict, because I think Montgomery handled the case, if I'm not mistaken. And I asked him, I said, well, what are you going to do? It appears that this jury believes that this gun did not belong to Aaron Harrison, right? Nor had he ever touched it. What are you going to do about that? Because the inference from all the evidence is that the cops threw the gun down. And you're not investigating that anymore? And that happens repeatedly.
What was his response, though, Charles?
Nothing. He said nothing. He kind of looked at me like, what are you asking that? That's old news. That's over. That's how they